Our guest speaker is Derrick Crowe, who is a Democrat running for Congress in Texas' 21st District. You may recognize that as Lamar Smith's district, the most infamous climate denier, I think, in Congress anyway, who just recently said he would not seek re-election. Derrick has been recognized as, in the national press, not just locally, but in the national press, as the science nerd because of the depth of his understanding of climate science and its implications and what we need to do in order to deal with it. So he has developed quite a national reputation, and we're very fortunate to have him here tonight. He's had a distinguished and varied career that includes some political work. He is a former senior staff member for several top Democrats in Washington, D.C., including Nancy Pelosi, Charlie Stenholm, and Adam Smith. He's also a former small business owner, and for several years has worked as a nonprofit professional. So Derrick pretty much has experience across any sector that you might be interested in. He was a member of 350 Austin's steering committee, and this is really why he's here tonight, until he resigned to run for Congress. He was with us for a short time, and we really valued him and his knowledge and his expertise. He has a vast knowledge of climate science and possesses a remarkable ability to speak articulately and passionately about these issues. So please join me in welcoming Derrick Crowe.
I just want to say, before we get off the topic of what 350 Austin has done over the course of the last year, I mean, there's several candidates here. And one of the reasons that I'm pointing that out is you know that you're achieving some organizing speed when political candidates start showing up in multiple numbers at your events. It shows that you're a power in the community. So you should congratulate yourself for that as well, because folks recognize that this is a group whose opinion matters in town. And I see a lot of faces that are really familiar, Charles and folks all over. And I just want to thank the folks who have done the hard work of getting this organization up and off the ground. Y'all have done something here in Austin that I think is an example nationwide. I think it was one of our proudest moments early on when Bill McKibben sent his greeting for the launch. And that tells you that what you're accomplishing here is getting the ball rolling for political movements across the country, and you're getting recognized for it. So I just want to congratulate you for that as well. I'm going to talk to you tonight about what the most updated indicators are for climate change and also the political environment for climate action and what's going on Capitol Hill. And I'm going to warn you, it can be kind of a downer through parts of this presentation, but I hope what you'll take from it is the seriousness of the threat and the urgency for action and the very small amount of time we have left to get the ball rolling for climate change action. And I'll tell you, the most important date for me in the history of climate change was August 25th, 2014. That was the date my son was born. That's my wife, Laurie, and that's the first moment she saw Henry. Henry is now 3, and that's the first time I got to hold him out from the incubator or whatever you call it, the little warming bin you put your baby in after he's not quite cooked, I guess. How many parents do we have in the room? Okay, there's several of you. So I'm going to talk to y'all specifically for a second because we share a moment here. And I think there's 2 moments kind of wrapped up in one. The first moment is the overwhelming joy. And then the second moment is the overwhelming terror that you're going to break it. And then the third moment that's kind of comes immediately after that is kind of the threat assessment. Like what's coming for your kid that you got to protect your kid from. And here's one of the main threats for my kid. This was 2 weeks after he was born. This headline in The Guardian: greenhouse gas emissions rise at fastest rate for 30 years. 2 months before Henry was born, another headline hit that I didn't include here, and it had to do with these sinkholes opening up in Siberia, where they were finding collapsed permafrost because it was warming up too much and releasing the gas. And this moment for me, these 2 moments together, was kind of when I stopped sleeping. And it's not just because I had a newborn, it's because the future had a lot more consequence for me than it did before. It wasn't some vague thing. It had a face, and I had responsibility to this specific person, and it made this issue one that I couldn't put down when I laid down in bed at night, and I really literally stopped sleeping because of this. And I just kind of want to talk about where we are right now and what the context is. You know, Henry's first year on Earth was the hottest year ever in the history of human civilization at that time. And you know, when you're a new parent who's aware of what's happening and that kind of headline hits, you think, okay, maybe it'll ease off. It didn't ease off. Every year after this has smashed the temperature record as the hottest year on record. This year, although it's not going to be the hottest overall year on record, it will be the hottest non-El Nino year on record. So the baseline is creeping up inexorably as we think about how we're going to take action here. So the flash you saw was my reaction to all this. I immediately threw myself into climate change activism, and I hope that you are all making the same decision right now. Your presence here indicates that that's the case, but I'm here to urge you to do everything you can and more to try to address this issue because of what's happening now. This is a recent headline. We had been celebrating in the climate change universe for a couple of years because the headline was that carbon emissions had detached themselves from economic growth for the first time, meaning that, you know, the markets were going up, but emission levels were staying steady. And it triggered this wave of think pieces about how finally the revolution's here and it's fine to just pursue economic growth with abandon because we finally got to this point technologically where it wasn't going to eat the planet alive. That was a false hope. This article goes on to say that this slow creep up is expected to continue, and this is a record level of emissions for the planet. So our action and our gathering here tonight is very urgent and very appropriate for the moment that we're in. This is the policy response. The United States went to Bonn and promoted universal access to fossil fuels at a climate change action conference internationally. And what they mean by this is essentially drill, baby, drill. It's exactly the wrong, most toxic action you could take, both from a diplomatic perspective, since we're now the only country not participating in the Paris Agreement. Even Syria is participating in the Paris Agreement, and their country is in ruins from the Civil War, caused by climate change, by the way. And this just shows you where we are right now. So this is where we are physically, temperature-wise. The year so far, compared to other January through October so far, you can see the basic trend. We are now in a period where we will never again see a colder than average year. I am willing to place a bet on that. We are done with colder than average years forever. And in this context, you can see at the end where Henry's born, the three big spikes at the end. That's his life so far. You know, folks like to talk, you know, I got into a little tussle with some of the local press early on in the campaign because I made this statement that Henry had been alive for the three hottest years on record. And there was some hemming and hawing among folks in the journalistic community that said, oh, but that's globally. What about here in Texas? I mean, it's everywhere. To think that because we're in the United States, we're going to be protected from this is just wrong. And we saw that with the weather events that happened immediately after with the hurricanes. And again, you know, January through October this year, for this year so far, the planet's been incredibly hot. The redder it is, the more anomalously warm it is. I'll draw your attention to the spot just below Greenland. There's a cold spot. And the reason that is significant is that the catastrophic scenario, the kind of day after tomorrow scenario, is that cold, fresh water off of Greenland melts and forms kind of a freshwater lens that just sits on top of the water. And it pushes the warm salt water under the ice shelves. And what that does is accelerate the breakdown of the ice, which will then be like a cork being taken out of a bottle. The land ice can start to slide off very quickly. And the phenomenon that goes along with that is the shutdown of the circulation in the Atlantic Ocean, which smooths out temperature gradients. So what you're essentially creating when that phenomenon gets real steam behind it is a permanent storm front in the Atlantic Ocean where there's really hot water next to really cold water, and you're set up for superstorms. And James Hansen, in his most recent paper, when he talked about this phenomenon, cited some examples of the historical record where those storms get so strong that they dredge up boulders off the ocean floor and throw them onto the shore. So we are flirting with phenomena that we can't even imagine in science fiction right now, and those dynamics are very slowly starting to take hold. So that's a point for urgent action here. And this is just all of last year, and you can see how pronounced the cold spot was last year during the El Nino year, which was hotter than normal. And you can see how much cold water is sitting there off Greenland. So what I'm showing you here in this this chart are 4 different assessments, because apparently the current member of Congress in this seat finds it somewhat controversial that global warming continues as a phenomenon. What Ted Cruz and Lamar Smith and folks in their cadre have tried to say is that NOAA and NASA have been cooking the books and creating a climate change phenomenon by being selective in their measurements. These are the 4 top climate science organizations in the world. It's NASA Goddard Institute, Hadley Center for Climate Research, NOAA, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency, all showing essentially the same phenomenon, that it's getting hotter, and there's just no denying it. And just to emphasize this, this is NASA saying so, and on their website, you can find, when the site is up, consensus statements from 18 scientific societies, all of the major interest groups that represent chemical companies or any company that's interested in science as a field, saying that human phenomena, human activity is behind climate change as a phenomenon. So here's an example of one of those statements. Greenhouse gases emitted by human activities are the primary driver, okay? But, oops, I don't know if, sorry, I keep hitting the button too much. That little flash there was the 404 page, because in a very suspicious manner, that NASA climate page is down quite a bit these days, kind of like the Obamacare website. Even after all that consensus, your current head of the EPA refuses to link carbon emissions to global warming. He is not convinced by the best scientists we have, the best scientists the Japanese have, the best scientists sponsored by federal research. He thinks that the real people we need to be asking about this is Congress, which has a great expertise apparently in matters of science. The report that flashed on the screen momentarily was the 11 federal agencies just not having any of this nonsense. Recently, they published what I'm going to show you some quotes from now, the Climate Science Special Report from the National Climate Assessment. Federal agencies, in kind of a show of defiance against this denialism coming from the administration, said, you know what, not quite true. And they made some very strong statements about the current state of the climate, which include, this period is now the warmest in the history of modern civilization. It is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And, for the kicker, there is no convincing alternative explanation supported by the extent of observational evidence. What they are telling us is, this is fact. There is no convincing, coherent explanation other than your carbon emissions are driving global warming, and the policy apparatus in the United States has to deal with it. So, and I'll just, I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I'm just setting you up for the policy environment that's in Washington right now. So the ways that you can tell, if you just want to go outside and look with your eyes without a satellite, you can see changes in the surface temperatures across the planet, melting glaciers, diminishing snow cover, shrinking sea ice, rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and increasing water vapor in the atmosphere. Those are just facts. And increasingly, we're being asked by folks who are currently in office to just ignore what we see. It's a very 1984 George Orwell situation where you just believe what the party says, irregardless of your own census. And what we've seen in response to that internationally is the Paris Climate Agreement, which, as we said before, we're the only ones not participating in. But folks don't often get to see the text of what this agreement says, so I like to pull out a couple of statements from it. And it says a couple of things that I think are really important. I had a lot of criticisms for this agreement for not saying words like fossil fuels or calling out oil companies specifically for their deception. But the things that it did include were really important. For example, we're going to pursue the best efforts to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We often talk about 2 degrees Celsius because that's where the climate scientists have kind of drawn the line for disaster in the United States. 1.5 degrees is when the island nations start going underwater. And there are already island nations that are planning the active evacuation of their citizens and the end of their countries as a political body. And because they know we are missing this target horribly. But we also say we're going to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science on the basis of equity. And that's important because what we're saying there is that we're not going to make the poor countries who didn't cause the problem be primarily responsible for solving the problem. And in a situation where countries like the United States and China are the primary drivers of the emissions right now, that's really important. That means that we have an obligation to these countries. And acknowledging that in an agreement is really important. If we're going to do those things, we have to actually be honest about the challenge. And this is where I think policymakers in DC and around the world are being very ill-served by the process that feeds them the information. What you're looking at, and I'm sorry it's a little bit of a grungy graphic here. I had to take a screenshot off a computer to get this because I can't find it anywhere else. This is a chart from a gentleman named Kevin Anderson. He's cited by Naomi Klein in This Changes Everything and some other of her works. He's at the Tyndall Climate Center in the UK, and what he has exposed from the IPCC projections, which are used by policymakers around the world, and which James Hansen has since come out and backed him up on, is that the projections that get used cook the books, but not in the way that Lamar Smith and his folks assert. The bottom yellow slice is what they're banking on in being included in what they call the carbon budget, which what you're looking at here is how much carbon we can burn and stay below our temperature targets. But what's happening right here is that we're counting on the deployment of a massive bit of infrastructure called BECCS, which is a kind of carbon capture out of the atmosphere, where essentially you plant a forest area the size of India every year, scrape it off the planet's surface, burn it, capture the carbon from those emissions, and sequester it underground. If we do that, the current cost estimates go up to about $500 billion in costs to implement that plan, which is to say it will not happen. But they use this to essentially double the carbon budget to play with because it allows scientists to talk in their political bodies without scaring the policymakers too much. James Hansen just sent out an email about this weekend called scientific reticence. That's that phenomenon. It's scientists going to Capitol Hill being too scared to actually level with policymakers because they want to still have access to those policymakers. So that's the environment that we're in. But we're not being honest about the depth and speed of the changes that need to happen because we're cooking the books so we don't scare Congress, essentially. So the problem is, if you don't cook the books, we are headed for a 4 to 6 degrees Celsius world. National promises under 3 to 4 degrees, under Paris, only get us to 3 to 4 degrees temperature increases. We need to get down under 1.5. That's before Trump pulls us out and starts smashing these agreements. And like I said before, what we're using now is a model that allows you to project essentially twice the carbon budget that we actually have. The issue that we're facing with here is that we are headed towards a scenario that society cannot adapt to. When we say that we're going to deal with climate change through mitigation and preparation and not through prevention, we are setting ourselves up for a planet in which we can't survive as a society. I'm going to give you a scenario that we may come back to in a slide in a second, and it's a scenario sketched out by James Hansen in one of his recent papers, where by mid-century this century, there are examples in the fossil record of multi-meter sea level rise at the temperature we're currently at now. If we hit the 2-degree projection, it's been enough in past configurations of the climate to cause multi-meter sea level rise in less than 100 years. If that happens, we will not be able to adapt in time to be able to govern the landmass that we're sitting on right now. It will cause so many people to move so quickly from so many major cities that we'll have internally displaced people in refugee camps all over the country. And that's a pretty severe scenario. The milder scenario, which has been sketched out in a recent study just for our area, shows that if we just have the middle of the road projections for the middle of the road sea level rise and we hit the 2-degree target, Austin Round Rock will have to absorb more than 800,000 people who are fleeing from the coasts. who will have to move because their communities are no longer viable. But the little footnote to that study is that the only people who can stay and survive are the people that make over $100,000 a year. But the worry in this report is that the poorer people won't be able to evacuate. Now, I want you to think about what that means. We saw Hurricane Katrina already. We saw people packed into a Superdome. That's what it looks like when poor people can't evacuate from a climate disaster. And they're talking about that on every coast by mid-century. So the real drawback that we're looking at here is that we have a Congress and a president who don't care, that they are engaged in calling everything they don't like to hear from fake news. Well, fake news is kind of the most lethal, direct, kind of like throwing a dart version of what the fossil fuel industry has been doing for the last 30 years. They've essentially been calling this science, which is some of the most well-attested science that we have as a society, fake. They've been saying that, there's debate when there's no debate. They've been saying that it's going to go slower when every indication that we find it's coming faster than we expected. And the problem with the concept of fake news is that it destroys our ability to agree on objective fact. And the reason that the current political system wants to destroy that agreement on a basic objective fact is that the truth has claims on your actions. If what the scientists are telling us right now is true, it demands urgent action. And that urgent action will damage some people's economic interests. But that is the game here. When you call climate science a Chinese hoax, they're trying to destroy the fact that we can even know about the future. Science is the closest thing we can have for seeing the future. And the future that I see for my son goes one of two ways. We either stay on the current course, and by the time he gets into kindergarten, we blow the carbon budget, possibly. The kicker to this presentation is that when you take these assumptions out that are in the IPCC projections that we talked about, which essentially are either magic or time travel, we have between 3 and 13 years before we blow the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is almost no time at all, which was true from the beginning of this year, meaning the end of the Trump presidency, to begin to bend that curve down. So the political action that's implied in that, and excuse me for being a tiny bit political, is people who believe in climate science have to take Congress this cycle. Because there's almost no hope, even in that situation, that we will hit that target, even if we get in that scenario. But there is no hope for saving island nations if we don't take Congress this year. Just to emphasize, this is what it means when people can't leave the scenario we're talking about. It means people who the basic functions of society break down. The death that you're seeing here is a person who just couldn't get a new oxygen tank because of the flooding. It's the most mundane breakdowns in the way that society works. And we'll have to face that across the board on every coast. I'm just passing here. We can't adapt to this. So the problem is, we don't know what the tipping points are. We know in broad strokes what the scenario is, but we will never the bell will not go off when we cross the threshold where the soil stops storing carbon. You're not going to get an alert on your phone when the ice system collapses so far that it's not reflective enough to stop the total collapse of the ice caps. You're not going to get, nobody's going to tweet at you to tell you that methane is coming out of the permafrost. You're just going to wander into it one day and lose the ability as a society to affect which direction the trends are going. Because there will come a point here, if we don't take action, that the carbon that's stored in the ground will be released in such massive quantities that nothing we can do can affect it. And we only have somewhere between 3 and 13 years before one of the big red lines comes our way. But what that means is emissions have to be brought to net zero yesterday. There is no time for incremental solutions right now. And that means, that we have to come, if you take all of these considerations that we said we believed in the Paris Agreement seriously, and we're not going to make the poor countries bear the majority of the burden, that means we have to give them a little more time than the rest of us to get their emissions to zero. But that means they have to be at zero in the non-OECD countries by 2050. But for us to give them the time to do that, we have to get it done by 2035. But that is a 12% year-on-year reduction starting January 1st of this year. So again, there's no scenario if we don't take control of Congress or local governments to the extent enough with people who believe in climate science where we can hit those targets. But what that means is there are real policy implications from here. And I'm going to take you through the broad strokes, and then I'm going to talk quickly about one of the bills that's in Congress that I think actually has a chance of getting something done. It means demand, not just the supply, has to be addressed, meaning it's not just about throwing up solar panels and wind turbines as fast as possible, although we absolutely have to do those things. It means we can't let people be so profligate with their energy uses. It means you can't just leave lights on all the time, essentially, in massive quantities, is one way of putting it. But if you think about it, 10% of the global emitters are responsible for 50% of the emissions. And the top 1% in the US have a carbon footprint 2,500 times that of the bottom 1%. Meaning they're basically, they use so much carbon that they're basically a small town walking around. So the thought experiment that Kevin Anderson suggests is just think about what happens if you limit the top 10% emissions to those of a typical European. That's a 33% emissions reduction. So that seems to argue for things like carbon taxes, where you make it harder for people to just throw carbon up into the air as long as you're giving the dividend back in a way that gets to everybody's bank account, so that the people who are using above average carbon are punished for it financially and everybody gets the benefit, so that it doesn't punish the people who are just using a little bit of carbon. So climate justice is really the only way of approaching this issue. It means fast near-term reductions in the top 10% emissions. It means that most of the global population isn't rich enough and can't even spend enough carbon to affect the solution here. It's all on rich countries like us. It's the rich and the very rich. So luckily there is one bill in Congress. I was very surprised to learn that there is a bill in Congress right now under a current representative that actually has a chance of addressing this issue. It is introduced by Tulsi Gabbard. It's called the Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act. And the basic scenario is that it transitions away, without even really considering things like carbon taxes, away from the use of fossil fuels. And it does it in a couple of ways. By 2027, it essentially says that you have a two-step step down from the use of carbon-based fuels. It means that we are going to amend the Internal Revenue Code to terminate fossil fuel subsidies. It means that we are going to permanently extend the credits for renewable energy, which Republicans are trying to end right now. It means we're going to permanently extend a business energy investment tax credit for solar or wind energy technologies. It essentially mandates the end of the fossil fuel economy on a timeline. And by doing that, it also argues for providing enough funding to retrain workers when they lose their jobs because the fossil fuel industry is coming to an end. And it prohibits the exports of domestically produced fossil fuels, essentially. We're not going to say we can't use them here and then export them so somewhere else can burn them. And it also means that we are going to invest in, at the Department of Labor, a Clean Energy Workforce Development Office so that we retrain workers. Now, some of the things that are missing from this are things like carbon fee and dividend proposals, things like carbon equivalency fees, which means you're taxing goods at the border that come in from countries that don't have a carbon fee on their goods. It means increasing the weatherization budgets, because that's a really quick way to increase both the energy efficiency and to make some good paying jobs right off the top. An infrastructure bill that has mass transit and charging stations for electric vehicles, ban on fossil fuel explorations, and actually funding the Department of Energy's energy efficiency and renewable energy R&D budgets. That department alone is responsible for a huge percentage of the affordability and efficiency of solar panels, and we just don't fund it enough. It's a winner for us if we actually fund it. So I'm going to leave you here with a little bit of a more emotional note than the dry numbers we've been talking about. This is the night before I filed to run for office. My son and I took a break and just had a little nap. My wife got a good photo of this. We've talked a lot about, really dry legislation and numbers and statistics. And 350's name even kind of takes you right to that place of like numbers and cents. But this is the kind of thing we're protecting here. When it gets right down to it, we're not interested in climate change action and political organizing around this issue because we care about charts or graphs or the composition of the atmosphere in just an agnostic sense. We're caring about protecting the things that we love. and making sure that the people we love and that we're responsible for have a future that we would feel proud to give them. And in the current political environment, we are not headed in that direction. And we talked a lot about fake news, but again, the reason that this is a tactic now on the part of the folks who want to keep, clean coal coming is that truth has claims on our behavior. And I want you to leave here tonight with the strong sense that there's no time left and that there's nobody else to do it but the people in this room. The people that are younger than us essentially in this room came along too late. And the folks that came before us didn't get it done in time. We have to own the moment here because there's no one else that's going to be capable of owning the moment ever again if the runaway effects take hold. And the timer is extraordinarily short. In fact, Henry here needs us to take action in 3 to 13 years. By the time he graduates high school, we're going to put the period on the end of the sentence that describes how we reacted to this moment. And on his behalf, as a dad, I'm asking you to take your participation in this group as seriously as if you were here to save the world, because you are here to save the world. And the good news is, if you look at those charts and you project them out over a 10,000 year time frame, once we get past 2100 and 2200, those lines go flat and they stay where they are essentially forever. So the risk is what we lose forever. But the hope is that what you save, you will save forever. The world gets to be your monument for every generation that comes after. So that's my setup for saying when they pass the coffee can in a minute, contribute, but also when we sign up for groups or we offer these actions like we talked about over the course of the last year, it is critically important that you show up now. Politicians need to hear from you. Your elected officials who are already in office need to hear from you, and your neighbors need to hear from you. Because the worst thing that happens when a fire alarm goes off is everybody looks around to see if anybody else is getting up. All of us have probably been in a scenario where somebody pulled a fire alarm and nobody moved. Well, somebody's got to move. And you're moving now, and I appreciate you doing that, and I thank you for your attention tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have, but I appreciate y'all coming here tonight and doing what you can do to save our planet. Thank you.